I'm not going to say much about you, except that you're the only woman legal advisor in the PLO discussions about peace. I don't know what that means. I've listened to peace talk now for 23 years, and I've stopped listening. And I'm really excited that you're here. I heard you speak about 5 years ago, and I loved hearing you, and I'm welcoming you. And happy International Women's Day. Come on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Barbara, for inviting me. Thank you to Becca. Thank you to Ziad for taking me around today, and Penny for organizing this so thoroughly. Before I talk a little bit today, I actually just wanted to also thank you, Barbara, for this project that you've been working on, Maya project in Gaza. As I was telling you earlier today, I used to live in Gaza. I lived there for about 1.5 years, and in addition to all of the stress that I felt living in Gaza, everything from bombs that were being dropped to the insecurity of myself, to the inability to be able to travel, to the ongoing militarization in Gaza. One of the most disconcerting things about living in Gaza at the time that I lived there, I'm sure that it's gotten worse since I left in 2006, was the lack of water. I remember days of not being able to get fresh water, of taking a shower when there was water available, and having clumps of my hair fall out of my hands from the saline water that was there. I remember living on the 11th floor of a building and having to carry up bottles of water up to the 11th floor because the electricity was often cut out. When the electricity cut, it meant that there was no water. And I remember at the time feeling privileged that I was able to walk up 11 flights of stairs with bottles and bottles and bottles of water. So I thank you for this project, and I know that it's small but growing, and thank you for thinking about the most basic necessity that people need in Gaza, and for really doing something about it. So I thank you for that. Yes, please. So, when I was first asked to speak by Mecca on International Women's Day, and as I was flying over here, I thought about why I was perhaps asked to speak on International Women's Day. And I could only come up with one answer, which is there was no real reason, really. And the reason I say this is because I'm not like most Palestinian women that I've met. I've never been in prison. I don't have a family. I've never had to live with the ongoing and daily stress of occupation and dispossession. I'm really an unremarkable woman. The only thing that I have is under my credit is that I was involved in a negotiations process that failed. So to put me up on the stage when there are so many other women, I'm very flattered, but I feel it's important for me to say that the real women are the women who are not here today. The real women are the women who are political prisoners, Palestinian political prisoners, who are still in jails. The real women are the women who are struggling in Palestine on a daily basis. The real women you should be hearing from are the women who are doing everything to fight against Israel and Israel's oppression. But given that I'm here, and given that I had this experience, I'm honored to be able to speak today. But I'm also very humbled by this invitation. Now, I've been asked to speak, and I've been thinking about the uprisings in the Middle East. And about the negotiations process, which I was a part for a number of years. And I think I want to talk about first is why it was that the PLO actually entered into negotiations more than 17 years ago. And it's very relevant in terms of what's going on today, particularly what's going on in Egypt and what's going on in the rest of the Arab world. And the reason that negotiations was a path that was pursued. If you look at Israel's intentions and what Israel's intentions have been over the course of the past 6 decades, the intention has been simply a very simple one, which is to replace one people with another. And the way that this pattern of replacing one people with another was done was either by getting rid of the non-Jewish population in what is now Israel, what is now the area under Israel's control, and at the same time bringing in and allowing for unfettered Jewish immigration into that very same land. So it's been a process of getting rid of and replacing, getting rid of and replacing. But that's not the only process that Israel has been engaging in over the course of the past 6 decades. There's a process that is actually far more insidious and much more important than that process, or not more important, but much more insidious, which is the attempt over the course of the past 6 decades to really divide up the Arab people from around the Arab world into little different cantons. So, and dealing with each of these little groups as little different cantons. So the approach that Israel has used in the past is to sort of divide and conquer strategy. That first strategy was employed when it came to Egypt, with the signing of what many would call a peace agreement, what I would call a surrender agreement with Egypt in 1979. Another agreement followed in 1994. And since that time, the entire strategy that Israel has had is to continually divide up Palestinians into one area into the next. So we hear about Palestinians who are from Gaza, with the accompanying signs that say "Free Gaza." We hear about the plight of Palestinians from the West Bank, the accompanying sign that says "Free the West Bank." We hear about the struggle of Palestinians from East Jerusalem. We hear about the struggle of Palestinians inside Israel, what is classified as Israel. And we hear about the struggle of Palestinians who are refugees living in camps all around the Arab world and beyond the Arab world. But with each of these groups, with each of these people, as the larger people, the attempt has always been really to try to divide and conquer. So first seek an agreement with the Egyptians and get all of the benefits that that entails. Second, seek an agreement with Jordan and get all of the benefits that that entails. And then slowly try to break down the Palestinian people as a people and try to carve up those people. And rather than focusing on the people as a whole, try to seek some sort of agreement, that you would call it that, and to get the benefits and the rewards from trying to seek that agreement. And so too, this was the process when it came to negotiations, that after there was an agreement that had been signed with Egypt, pretty much on the heels of the agreement that was signed with Jordan, Israel's new focus became on parceling up the Palestinians as a people and trying to seek a so-called agreement with them. But just in the same way that Israel managed to get an agreement with Egypt in 79 and then with Jordan in 94, there were a lot of benefits that came to the pursuit of these so-called agreements. So for example, during the period of Oslo, there were a number of countries that ended up establishing diplomatic relations with Israel. 34 separate countries established diplomatic relations with Israel from 1993 to the year 2000. There were trade offices that ended up opening up from as far as Morocco to Oman in the Arab world. The image that Israel had of being an occupier, an oppressor, was suddenly beginning to fade. And in its place, instead, Israel established what was called the peace process, and so the peace process continued. But rather than punishment being attributed to Israel or being feted on Israel for its continued violations of human rights law, for its continued violations of international law, Israel instead ended up getting more and more and more benefits, just in the same way it got more and more benefits when it established an agreement with Egypt, when it established an agreement with Jordan. So this, in addition to all of the diplomatic relations that it brought, was money. More and more US dollars ended up coming into Israel. And in addition to more and more dollars, the simple act of stopping settlement activity in the West Bank is something that even Israel didn't find itself useful to do. From the period of 1993 to the year 2000, when negotiations were at their peak, the actual number of settlers ended up doubling in the West Bank. And today, it's almost triple what it was in 1993, so a mere 17 and a half years ago. So you can see what the trend has been. The trend has been an attempt to divide, an attempt to conquer, an attempt to reap benefits, an attempt to continually continue this process of replacing one people with another, with absolutely no impunity on the part of Israel. And this is what the process had entailed, that while there were people who were happy and euphoric and hoping that negotiations were going to yield something, the critics, including individuals such as Edward Said and others, came forward and said, wait, this process is not going to be about leading to freedom for Palestinians. Don't delude yourselves. This process is simply going to give Israel the green light to continue to do what it's done over the course of the past 4 decades. And not only continue to do what it's done, but give Israel the legitimacy to continue to do what it's done over the course of the past 4 decades. And so what we ended up seeing during the process of negotiations was first that he was right, that the process of replacing one people with another continued. But a second and much more alarming trend that ended up happening was the division of Palestine into these small little entities of Area A, Area B, Ramallah, Gaza, so on and so forth. But not only that, with Palestinians now serving as the security subcontractor to Israel's military occupation. In addition to the Palestinian Authority becoming Israel's security subcontractor to the occupation, we ourselves started to use the language that the Israelis had set up. We ourselves started to define ourselves as Palestinians from Gaza. We started to define ourselves as Palestinians from the West Bank. We started to define ourselves as Palestinians from inside. We started to define ourselves as Palestinians from East Jerusalem. We started to define ourselves as Palestinians in the diaspora. And what we ignored was the idea that we are a nation, we are a people, and that together, collectively, we have to fight and be able to overcome Israel's attempt to try to replace us with another people. But during the negotiations, what ended up happening, as I indicated, was first that this process was allowed to continue. The second was that we took over that lingo. But not only did we allow this process to continue and adopt the lingo that ended up happening, but we ended up believing that somehow negotiations between a very powerful party and a very weak party was somehow going to yield a resolution, that somehow it was going to yield a deal. This is what's now become very apparent when we read the Palestine papers, the papers that came out by Al Jazeera in January earlier January this year, this year. Now, the Palestine papers, which are really a small number of papers, small number of documents in the context of all of the documents, 1,600 or maybe 10 or 15,000 documents. And so you can't really draw full conclusions about what happened during the negotiations process, but you can draw some conclusions about what happens in the negotiations process. And the main conclusion that should be drawn from those papers, it has to be drawn from those papers, is that no matter how much the PLO was willing to concede, and trust me, it's more than anybody was willing to accept, no matter how much they were willing to concede, at every step of the way, the Israeli response was always one response: not enough. So what's become clear during this negotiations process is that Edward Said and the critics and everybody else was right. The process was simply one of being used to try to legitimize the replacement of one people by another and make that somehow acceptable. This is why the UN Security Council veto is actually very important. The Security Council veto came, the last Security Council veto on settlements came at the time of Carter, and I hate to think that we now look back on the Carter regime as being one that is somehow hurtful. But the last veto came in 1979 with the Carter regime. And the reason that there has been, the last UN resolution, the reason there have been vetoes every single time since the Carter regime when it comes to settlements is because the United States no longer recognizes that the policy of replacing one people with another is actually illegal. What instead the viewpoint is that the process is illegitimate. And that it's not just the process that's illegitimate, but the continued process is somehow illegitimate. Which begs the question, well, at what point does it begin that the process becomes illegitimate? Is it that the process becomes illegitimate tomorrow? Was the process illegitimate yesterday? At what point in time do we begin to run the clock and say that the process is now illegitimate? This is precisely why this process has failed. The process has been one of simply having negotiations for the sake of negotiations. It's been a process in which we ourselves have legitimized this process of replacing one people with another. And not only that, but we've made sure that the world stands silent and does absolutely nothing. This is why the developments that are happening today in the Middle East have to be viewed not only in the context of uprisings, as discrete uprisings, but as a tsunami, as something that is much wider, much more encompassing, and much broader than simply, as Thomas Friedman and others would have you believe, demonstrations against unemployment, demonstrations against poverty, demonstrations against all of the economic indicators that the IMF and the World Bank have put forward. These are not demonstrations against economic indicators. They are much broader than that. And what it is that this is now an attempt by the Arab world to seize back the moment during which the world has tried to divide the Arab nation into these small little parcels, as I mentioned earlier, and separate us. But instead now, the process of what's happening in the Arab world is a revolt against that. The uprisings didn't begin in Tunisia. The first uprising actually began in Palestine 2 decades ago. The second uprising began also in Palestine a decade ago. And since that, we're now beginning to see these successive uprisings that are taking place in the Arab world. Again, not against economic indicators, but against this demand that political repression in order to seek stability for Israel is now something that we have to continue to challenge. Now, this brings me to one point, which is how should we be seizing the moment now, and how should we be moving forward? And I think that in moving forward, we have to recognize what has failed. And as I mentioned, the negotiations process failed, and will continue to fail. There will never be a successful negotiations process between a very weak party and a very powerful party. It's not in the cards. But when will succeed? What is happening today vis-a-vis Israel is that alongside Israel's process of dividing Palestinians into various subgroups, the other process that has continued is a process of trying to push Palestinians out of the minds of Israelis. And the way that this process has taken shape is the Cantonization process that I mentioned, putting Palestinians into small reservations. But more importantly, and stronger than that, has been an attempt to actually delegitimize Palestinians and demonize Palestinians in the minds of Israelis through fear, through separation, and through other tactics. And so today in Israel, Israelis are actually not paying a price for Israel's ongoing military occupation. Instead, it's rather the opposite. More and more countries are coming forward and giving money to Israel, including More and more countries are trying to give more incentives to Israel to even engage in yet another peace process, including Europe and others. And rather than using a stick, there seems to be more and more and more carrots that are being offered. And to the average, to Israelis, what this has now entailed is that they are able to have a very peaceful, a very quiet occupation, a very peaceful, a very quiet dispossession, a very peaceful, a very quiet displacement. Israel today is not affected by any of the decisions, any of the UN resolutions, any international law that is in place. Instead, the only measure that seems to be being put forward is that of carrots. So what do I advocate? I think the time has now come for us to continue to use sticks. And what I mean by sticks is that we really have to start looking at a process of divesting, a process of boycotting, and a process of sanctions. But in talking about boycotts, in talking about divestment, and talking about sanctions, I think we also cannot be shy about the scope of boycotts. We cannot be shy about the scope of divestment, and we cannot be shy about the scope of sanctions. When in South Africa during the apartheid era, and I certainly don't need to be educating anybody here about South Africa apartheid, we weren't shy about opposing cultural boycotts. We weren't shy about academic boycotts. There was certainly no shyness around consumer boycotts. And so too when it comes to Israel, we cannot continue to remain shy about wide-ranging sanctions, including academic boycotts, including cultural boycotts, including consumer boycotts. The sanctions have got to begin to hit the average person in the nation. That's the only way that Israelis will begin to realize that the policies that the government is carrying out in its name and the benefits that it is reaping from these policies that it is imposing in its name are going to are actually illegal and contrary to law. This is the only way I think that we can move forward. Now, in terms of moving forward, I know that there has been a lot of work surrounding boycotts and surrounding divestment, surrounding sanctions in this country, but there has to be much, much, much more. And we've got to continue to be pursuing this path of boycotts and divestment in a way that is much more organized, much more concerted, and much stronger. Now, just today, the Israeli Knesset passed the first reading of a bill that would criminalize boycotts and divestment and sanctions. And let me be very clear on this. I'm an Israeli citizen. I will be affected by this law. And I will tell you this, I'm not afraid, and nobody else who is advocating boycotts, divestment, or sanctions is afraid. We are ready and willing to be criminal, to be treated. Now, I want to end, because I promised Penny that I'd give lots of room for questions. I want to end just by talking about, in particular, one woman who was one of the most influential women, at least in my life. Tell you a little bit about her story and about her struggle and what she taught me. The person that who has influenced me the most in my life is not a sort of great figure that certainly not anybody that you know. She was my grandmother. My grandmother had 22 children. Was a fantastic woman who, in 1948, was forced to flee her home in the Galilee. She fled in 48, went off to Lebanon, where she lived for a period of 6 months, fled from Lebanon to Syria, where she lived for a period of about 2 years, and then from Syria went to Jordan at this point she had 10 children, with 10 of her children. And then grandmother was subsequently picked up by the Israeli authorities and charged with being an infiltrator into her own country. After she was found guilty of infiltration, a charge which she stood up and proudly said, how can I be infiltrating my own country? This is my country. You infiltrated, I didn't infiltrate. She was ordered deported. And following a series of her own uprisings, getting the neighbors and others and the tenants and everybody involved, she ended up not being deported. She ended up averting her deportation. Now, I was really struck by this story when I was very young, and I asked my grandmother, I didn't ask the question that most people ask, which is, why did you flee? I asked her a question that was a little bit different, which is, why did you come back? And my grandmother said, she said, you know, Diana, when I first fled, we were told that the Iraqi army was going to come in and save us. And we were told that it was just going to be a matter of days with the army gone before they would liberate Palestine. And days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. And she said, and at a certain point I realized that the Iraqi army wasn't coming. Wasn't coming. And so I decided that I had to do something else, which is I had to liberate my country and myself with my own hands. This is the woman who's the most inspirational